If you're anything like me, you absolutely love digging into the past. But what if I told you that a massive chunk of what we just accept as hard historical fact is actually a total distortion? Seriously, we've all grown up with these vivid, iconic stories about the past, and they really shape how we view the world today. But as we'll see, the historical record is surprisingly fragile. Through simple misunderstandings, deliberate manipulations, or just the sheer power of a really good story, history gets entirely rewritten. Today, we're going to peel back the layers and unveil the reality behind the myths. Okay, let's dive right into this. Did a young Albert Einstein actually sit there staring blankly at a failed math test? And did Emperor Nero casually play the fiddle while Rome literally went up in flames? I mean, we all know these stories, right? They're huge cultural touchstones. But here's the kicker. They are completely, 100% false. No way around it. So how on earth did we get it so wrong? Section 1. Lost in Translation. Misunderstood History. So the familiar myth is that Einstein failed math, but the reality? The guy was an absolute math prodigy. He had mastered complex algebra and geometry by age 12 and calculus by 15. So where did this massive lie come from? Well, it was just a simple misunderstanding of the Swiss grading system. At his school, a 6 was actually the highest possible score. This totally flipped the scale used in other European countries where a 1 was the best. People just looked at his grades, saw numbers that usually meant failure everywhere else, and boom, a legendary myth was born. Einstein himself actually had to publicly clarify later in life that, no, he never failed mathematics.
Speaking of numbers, let's talk about the measurement 5 foot 6 inches. This specific height spawned a massive psychological concept, the Napoleon complex. The idea of a tiny, angry man overcompensating for his short stature. Well, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually 5 foot 6 to 5 foot 7. And back in his era, that was completely average, maybe even slightly above average. The illusion that he was incredibly short came from two things. First, his height was recorded using the old French inch system, which made the numerical value seem way smaller when poorly converted into English inches. Second, he constantly surrounded himself with his imperial guards who were absolute giants for the time. Put anyone next to them and they'd look tiny.
Then there's the age of 30. You hear this all the time. Medieval people were practically considered elderly by the time they hit 30. But this number is a heavily distorted average. The math was dragged way, way down by staggeringly high infant mortality rates. If a person actually survived childhood, historical records and skeletal evidence prove they frequently lived well into their 50s and 60s. So they weren't just mysteriously dropping dead of old age at 30. The math of averages simply paints a really misleading picture of adult life back then. Now, what's really interesting is how literal and cultural misunderstandings just cement themselves into our brains. For instance, vomitoriums. They absolutely weren't purging rooms for overly full, decadent Romans. Nope, they were just architectural passageways designed to quickly spew forth or empty out massive crowds. And the whole idea that medieval Europeans believed in a flat earth? Total fabrication. Educated people, dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks, knew the earth was a sphere and had even calculated its circumference. Also, Jesus' birth date, the exact day is totally unknown. December 25th was likely chosen by early Christians and Emperor Constantine to basically align with and eventually replace existing pagan winter solstice festivals like Saturnalia. Section 2. The Power of Propaganda. Deliberate Manipulation. First, let's define what we mean here. Propaganda is the deliberate spreading of information, rumors, or caricatures to either harm a rival or elevate a cause. When it comes to history, propaganda is basically the ultimate tool to take incredibly complex rulers, intricate geopolitical situations, or even entire nations and just flatten them into cartoon villains. Which brings us right back to Nero. Remember that fiddle? Well, for starters, the violin literally wouldn't even be invented for nearly 1,000 years after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Plus, the historian Tacitus recorded that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire broke out. When he heard the awful news, he rushed back, organized massive relief efforts, and actually opened his own palaces to shelter the homeless. The whole image of him casually playing music when people died, that was just a metaphor for political neglect. It was shaped by later rival writers who really wanted to cement his legacy as the symbol of pure corruption, a completely turned into a cartoon villain. And Nero is definitely not alone here. Cleopatra was constantly painted as a purely seductive beauty, completely ignoring her staggering intelligence and brilliant political skill. Galileo, he wasn't jailed simply for his science. He was actually put under house arrest for publicly insulting the Pope, who was ironically his own funder. And think about World War I. For a century, the Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany alone for starting the war. This acted as deliberate Allied propaganda to obscure a really complex, continent-wide web of secret treaties, imperial rivalries, and mutual mobilizations. We see this kind of complexity in other major 20th century events, too. History is always a multifaceted puzzle. For example, the Allied powers in World War II did not initially enter the conflict to stop the Holocaust. In fact, anti-Semitism was tragically widespread in the West at the time. Similarly, while Gandhi's nonviolent movement was absolutely crucial to Indian independence in 1947, the full picture also relied heavily on armed movements, alternative leaders like Subhash Chandra Bose, and the massive post-war economic strain placed on Britain. History rarely rests on just a single puzzle piece or a single person.
Section 3. Pop culture and fiction sensational stories.
Take the universally recognized horned Viking helmet. Guess what? Real Vikings never, ever wore these into battle. I mean, think about it. They'd get totally tangled in trees or easily grabbed by enemies. Authentic archaeological finds, like the smooth Yermanbabu helmet, show incredibly practical armor. The horns? Those were purely theatrical. They were invented by 1800s opera costume designers just to give the characters a dramatic stage presence. And this brilliantly illustrates how sensationalism heavily shapes our shared knowledge. For example, astronauts confirm you absolutely cannot see the Great Wall of China from space with the naked eye. That myth was actually popularized by a 1932 Ripley's Believe It or Not illustration. Van Gogh, he didn't sever his entire ear. During a period of severe distress, he only severed his lower earlobe. And the extremely famous story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocking over a lantern and starting the Great Chicago Fire, entirely fabricated by a newspaper reporter who was just desperately seeking a sensational scapegoat for a good story. Fiction also dramatically distorts our historical timelines. Columbus didn't discover America in 1492. Indigenous peoples had lived there for millennia, and Norse explorers actually arrived centuries earlier, around 1000 AD. And what about Paul Revere? He wasn't some lone writer shouting, "The British are coming" in 1775. It was a massive secret network effort. His whole lone hero status was practically invented out of thin air in 1861 by a very dramatic Washington Irving poem. Hollywood is arguably the biggest culprit we face today. Films like The Last Samurai tell us samurai absolutely despised firearms. But in reality, when Portuguese traders brought guns to Japan in 1543, samurai quickly adopted and mastered them. Warlords like Oda Nobunaga used highly advanced gun formations to totally crush traditional cavalry. That cinematic trope of noble warriors rejecting modern technology, pure fiction. Similarly, epic movies always show the Egyptian pyramids being dragged into place by thousands of brutalized slaves. But archaeological excavations paint a vastly different picture. They were built by paid, highly skilled laborers. We've actually found their villages, complete with bakeries, dormitories, and even hospitals. They ate meat regularly and were deeply honored for their work. We also have these incredibly persistent visual myths. The Salem witch trials, they rarely involved fire. Instead, victims were tragically hanged or pressed with heavy stones. Burning witches was actually a European practice mistakenly applied to colonial Massachusetts. And historical corsets weren't the horrific torture devices Hollywood portrays either. For the vast majority of women, they were everyday, cloud-like supportive garments designed primarily for back support, basically very much like a modern bra. Section 4. Rethinking the historical record, constantly evolving. Take the tragic loss of the Great Library of Alexandria. The super dramatic myth is that it all burned down in one single, catastrophic, civilization-setting backfire. But the reality is far less cinematic, though still incredibly tragic. Its decline was a really slow process over several centuries. Julius Caesar accidentally burned some nearby warehouses in 48 BC. Centuries later, in 391 AD, a Christian mob destroyed the connected Serapeum library, and then further losses occurred during the Arab conquest in 642 AD. It was simple neglect and repeated political conflicts, not one giant Hollywood-style inferno, that slowly erased all that knowledge. So the crucial point is that modern science literally allows us to rewrite history today. For generations, rats took all the blame for spreading the Black Death, which tragically killed a third of Europe in the 14th century. But recent modeling by researchers at the University of Oslo changes everything. When they ran the data, the historical death rates just didn't match the slower spread of rat-based plagues. The model that fit perfectly? human-to-human transmission via our very own fleas and lice. We blame the rodents for centuries, but new scientific analysis points the finger right back at human parasites.
History is clearly not simply what happened, it's what was recorded, translated, and dramatized. We've unlearned a lot of persistent myths today, which leaves us with a fascinating and maybe slightly unsettling thought. What widely accepted historical facts taught in schools today will be completely debunked by the explainers of the next century? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning what you know, and I'll see you in the next explainer.